In central banking news, the Federal Reserve minutes show that there is discord among the Federal Reserve board members as to how to go about reducing and the pace at which we need to go about reducing the purchase of securities following a period of inflation. If you don't know what the Federal Reserve has been doing in recent months to try to prevent there from being an economic collapse on top of the coronavirus pandemic, what the Federal Reserve has done is bought corporate debt and bought mortgage-backed securities, which are the things that led to the '08 financial collapse. If you don't have any understanding of how markets work, let me explain it to you this way. When people believe that the economy is going to be growing, they believe that companies are going to be doing well, they will buy their debt. It's just like if you think that your friend has enough money or has the potential to make enough money to pay you back, you'd be very willing to give them a loan. But in a situation where the economy goes sour, people don't think that they're going to get their money back, so they're a lot more hasty to make loans. And coming up to the coronavirus, we had been on an upward market trajectory for a long enough period, and we had seen indicators that a recession was inbound. Now, recessions are bad things in the short term, but good things in the long term, because once the market reaches a peak that's too high, people get out over their skis, the market corrects, people lose money in the short term, but it means that the money that was misallocated that led to the market peaking eventually ends up properly allocated. And this is how capitalism functions when it actually functions. So we were at this peak before coronavirus happened, and then the coronavirus hits, and the government officials, maybe rightfully, depending on who you ask, say, okay, we need to stabilize the economy because we can't deal with telling all these people to stay home while the economy bursts, which it looked like it was going to do anyway, and which would have been a good thing. So what they did was basically buy a bunch of securities. They bought a bunch of debt. They made up for the decrease in demand for debt by buying trillions of dollars of it in unprecedented fashion. The beginnings of these tools that they're using now came out of the '08 financial crisis when they had to dig deep to get the economy out of the recession. And they've discovered that they basically have limitless powers. And they've been using them over the course of the coronavirus pandemic and purchasing a lot of corporate debt. Now, that has actually been one of the things that causes the inflation, because inflation happens. It can happen when the market naturally overheats, and it's happening in this instance because the market is overheating due to the influence that the Federal Reserve is having on top of investors who are pumping and pumping and pumping more money into the economy. And when you see Senator Bernie Sanders complain, the American people lost X dollars of wealth while the millionaires and billionaires have gained, whatever ridiculous amount of wealth that they have over the course of the pandemic, it's because of this policy. Because if you're a millionaire, a billionaire, the odds are that you are making your money not through an income stream like a regular person does, where you go to work and you get paid. You're making your money through owning securities. Like, look at Jeff Bezos. His wealth is directly derived from the fact that he owns huge amounts of stock of Amazon. So when everybody in the country no longer wants to go to a store and buys everything off of Amazon, he is enriched greatly. And what the Federal Reserve did in propping up the markets in this way was, one, saved a lot of companies from going belly up, because if the economy collapses, the stock market crashes, it means that demand for goods and services goes down. It means that businesses' ability to access capital goes down, which mean that businesses close their doors and means that people lose their jobs. So the government made the decision to avoid this by purchasing a lot of bonds on the open market to keep our economy afloat. But the other edge of that sword is this directly benefits all of the people who hold stock, which happen to be all of the people who have already amassed wealth in our economy. So while the normal everyday American, most Americans don't have $1,000 in their bank account, so they certainly don't have substantial holdings in Fortune 500 companies, loses their job or takes a pay cut because of COVID, you see the disparity between those people and the people who millionaires and billionaires who are either the billionaire class who own a lot of stock, or are people who are in the upper middle class or upper class but aren't, at the millionaire and billionaire level, see their portfolios rise. And a lot of people might think that that's not a good thing, because it comes directly at the expense of the rest of the American taxpayers, because we're buying these shares, we're buying this corporate debt. It's not free. And also, they've prevented the economy from going through the natural cycles that it needs to go through, right? The economy cannot go up forever. That's just impossible. It always works out such that the capitalism, the markets correctly allocate capital, and then they over-allocate to certain industries, and so the market crashes and it goes back up. If you don't have that, then you end up with massive amounts of capital allocated to the wrong places. Basically, once you have too much money allocated to things that aren't making the most money possible, the market gets out of whack, and you see a crash. The very good lesson for this can be taken from the dotcom bubble, which happened late 90s, early 2000s, when people were investing because the internet was so hot. People were throwing gobs and gobs of money at these companies that had really no revenues, just because the idea of investing in the internet became so popular. And it got to the point where this was unsustainable. There was not the required returns being generated, and the value of those companies kind of crashed overnight when people realized this. And while this stings, it's also good, because that means that the money which was misallocated then gets put into the correct things, and the economy self-corrects. And this is the miracle of capitalism. This system, when not hindered and not messed with from the outside, is the most efficient way to allocate resources that exists. And I know capitalism is not perfect. Believe me. I mean, look at the world we're living in right now. But at a fundamental level, there is not a better way to allocate resources. And so the Federal Reserve stepping in here and messing with that necessary cycle, while they might have done it for a good reason, is something that can have terrible impacts on the long-term health of our economy. And the reality is that when those chickens come home to roost, people aren't going to say, wow, capitalism is an effective system that was corrupted by the money-holding class who use their influence over the Federal Reserve to preserve the value of the assets they hold. And that's a really bad thing, but capitalism as a whole is really good. No, what people will end up saying is, capitalism is horrible. We need to move towards socialism. I mean, and you can see this as a direct offshoot of the 2008 financial crisis, where similar corruption happened within the markets, directly led by the government. If you don't know what led to the 2008 crisis, the federal government said, you need to provide mortgages to underserved people, underserved communities. And the reality is that the ability of these people to pay their mortgages was questionable. If you were alive then, you might have gotten a mortgage on a house that you probably should not have because of this. And this happened to a lot of people. The value of all these houses went up because a ton of people were buying houses. So the values of houses go up, go up, go up. And then they take these mortgages, and it's not like the olden days where you would go to the bank, you would take out a mortgage with the bank, and then they would hold that mortgage and you would pay them and pay them and pay them over the course of years. And if you were not able to pay the bank, the same bank that you took the loan from, that bank would be the people who would come and repossess your house. This was a good system in that it encouraged the bank to make loans which they felt could be repaid. Instead, what happened would be there would be one entity who would make the loan to you. This would be the bank that you would go to get the loan. And they did not give a damn about whether you would actually repay that loan, because what they would then do is sell it to an intermediary, a financial company. So this first bank makes the loan to you, they sell it, they make their money, they don't care. Then this intermediary company comes in, chops the loan up, into what's called a mortgage-backed security. So basically, instead of buying the risk of one loan, what they do is aggregate a bunch of these loans together, which means that if one person defaults, it's not a big deal because you're actually owning a bunch of slices of loans. Now, this went very wrong because this institution would then go and sell those mortgage-backed securities to people who were looking to make a return on their investment. Basically, the promise being, okay, you now own all these pieces of these loans, you get to collect that money. And this became a very hot financial instrument. And this became a very hot financial instrument with the direct aid of the federal government, who was doing a policy that was arguably good, trying to help these people get homes that could not afford loans because they were too risky of individuals to insure. And this cannot be solely blamed on the federal government because the bankers made their money, the financial institutions which repackaged these loans into these mortgage-backed securities made their money, and everybody was enjoying making the money while they could. But then it all came tumbling down because it turns out that one, these homes were overvalued, and two, many of these people who were issued these loans, in fact, could not pay them back. And so that means that millions of Americans' homes were foreclosed upon. It means that the financial system crashed. And what ended up happening was people were angry. Out of this, we saw the Occupy Wall Street movement. We saw the Tea Party being born. The Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street initially kind of converged, but as Occupy Wall Street took a more leftist angle, they went their separate ways. And this was what propelled largely the progressive era that we see now. And that's also what propelled the Tea Party, which came into power. If you remember, they were the group of people that got propelled into Congress on the midterm election of Barack Obama's first term. And that group of people is said to be the genesis of the Make America Great Again way of thinking, and that was said to be the genesis of that wing of the Conservative Party, as well as the death of the neocon wing of the party, which we've now seen. So there's disagreement among these Federal Reserve officials now about what to do, because it's clear that there is inflation, the highest gas prices we've seen in decades. Lumber costs 300% more than it did this time last year. And one of the so the way that the Federal Reserve Board is organized is there's, I don't know how many, around 10 Federal Reserves banks throughout the country, and they each submit a director, and all these directors meet on a board, and they make the very important decisions of what the interest rates are set at, and if the Federal Reserve is taking action in the markets as they are right now, they vote on that policy and they release the minutes, and this has huge impacts. The minutes of the meeting, the notes of the meeting, they release this, and this has huge impacts on the economy because the policy of the Federal Reserve dictates the availability of capital. And now there is disagreements within the Federal Reserve, and usually the notes from the meetings, the minutes, are fairly unanimous. There's not too much disagreement. They usually make their decisions, and the minutes of the meeting pretty much just say the decision they've made. But the director from the Texas, I believe Dallas Federal Reserve, but I could be incorrect on that one, has come out and said, I think that we need to slow down our acquisition of these bonds faster than we are currently planning on doing because of the impacts on inflation that these bonds can and are having. So it will be very interesting to see in the short term what the Federal Reserve ends up doing, since they are backpedaling on their inflation-causing policies. And two, it will be interesting to see in the long term what the effect is of their overstimulation of the economy. In my opinion, the next downturn that we have economically will be terrible because of this overstimulation. Thank you for sticking with me throughout this video. I know I went to a lot of different places than the original story. If you made it this far, consider subscribing to my channel because I think that you will enjoy my content.